it's like if you do have that viewpoint of like the patriarchy is the problem, it can get really tricky because you might feel like you, the person that's making that claim or demand of like, I'm trying to force other people to be accountable. I'm trying to force men or whatever, whoever it is in society that's done these things, that maybe holds these beliefs. I'm trying to hold them accountable. I'm trying to force them to do what you and I were talking about in the first half of this conversation. So I'm trying to push them towards that. And you're kind of saying back to it, like, cool, I'm okay with that. But as long as you're doing the same for yourself. So it's not just putting everything on that side. Is that kind of the way you're looking at it?
Right. You know what's interesting? One analogy I like to use is that because, for example, I'll hear the pushback. I've had this conversation with women, and they'll say, "Well, instead of saying that women need to pick better, we need to just focus on men being better men." And I say, "You're right, but here's the thing: we can say that car thieves should not steal cars, right? We can agree with that. They shouldn't steal
Mm-hmm.
cars, but we still don't leave our cars open and just hope they won't steal cars. We still lock our doors, still have the clutch thing or whatever it's called,
The club, what was it called? The club? No,
the club, right? The
yeah,
thing, remember the thing that you would put
yeah,
on
yeah.
the wheel. So you still do that. So yes, of course, obviously we have law enforcement, we have deterrence, but we don't depend on that exclusively.
Mm.
I think it's a two-pronged issue, not just a singular, they need to do better and that's it.
Yeah, because there's always that chance. And again, I say this with full sensitivity. This is
Mhm.
the show, right? We're exploring. There's always that chance that that human nature we talked about before, if given the opportunity to say, "Oh, it's not me," like I don't have to take any responsibility. I can put it on somebody else.
Oh, of
That's
course.
such a convenient place for our minds to go. And it
It is.
becomes so hard when you have reason to believe that, where it feels justified, where maybe you have been mistreated as a woman, or you have seen a history of women not being treated fairly, where it
Sure.
seems justified. So that's such a slippery slope and a dangerous game you're playing, you know?
Right.
Mm,
So I could say too, as far as, or what I would say to anyone in that situation, a man or a woman, when you're in that situation and you're being mistreated, and so that's making you feel terrible, right? So if you're not to a point where you're going to do anything about it, you're just in a reactive state where you're just hoping, please, please stop mistreating me.
mm,
Please do better. I demand you do better. You're angry, right? Justified. However, that anger is not going to necessarily make that person,
mm,
change,
mm.
or, so you have to change yourself. Like I can be angry towards you and I can say, oh, I wish you would do something different. I hope you do this. I hope you do that. Versus if I say, you know what, you're going to do what you're going to do.
Mm,
This is what I am able to do.
mm,
And so immediately, I believe that will make a person feel better because you're taking control for
mm,
yourself.
mm. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Mhm.
Let me ask you, and where you're comfortable going with this, obviously, because it's
Sure.
we're dancing and swimming in provocative stuff, but like, what if is there a scenario where it's possible that, and let's stick with the patriarchy concept because we're talking about it, where like maybe it is just maybe it is the right approach, maybe it is fair for people, women, all people to feel, or other people to feel like no, like there is actually a genuine problem here. It is right to go out and demand men to be better, men to change, because there's a long history, thousands of years of women being treated a certain way. Like, what if that is the case? Like, how would we know it? Like, is it possible? Does that scenario ever happen where that's actually true and we do say we need to really look outside?
Sure. I think that actually, funny enough, I believe that is a part of being accountable. So, for example, if you've been on the receiving end of being wronged, then part of being accountable for being fair is you saying, you know what, I'm going to decide to push back on that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to demand, I'm going to assert myself. I'm going to say, like where you see the Me Too movement, for example, to
Sure.
say, okay, this is unacceptable. And I believe that there's been strides made in that regard, I would say.
See,
So
that's tricky though, right? Because there's likely instances. Well, let me
mhm,
know if you agree, because
sure.
I would imagine if we're trying to get to the truth of it, there's
Mhm,
likely instances of people who think they're doing that. They're saying I've been wronged, I've seen or wrong.
mhm,
Now and I'm justifiably, rightfully speaking out against it because that we need to fight. Like a fight needs to happen here. This isn't going to change on its own.
sure.
And those same people sometimes can be criticized because it looks like they're not taking accountability. And there are people, I'm not saying you in this case, but there are people out there that are like demonizing that and saying, well, people should just take it. Almost some people would call it like victim shaming. Like, well, you just need to figure it out yourself. It's your
Right,
problem. Like, you must have
right.
done something.
Mhm,
And like making sure we don't do that. And I know it goes back to that nuance we were talking about before,
Of
but
course.
that's something I see sometimes in society. Like, I think what you're saying is right. It's
Mhm.
complicated, it's nuanced. We have to look at it for what it is. There's probably some degree that's personal responsibility, some degree it's outside of it.
Right.
But likely there's some points in which people are trying to fight that good fight, and then they're being chastised for it or being insulted for
Course.
it because it
Of
seems like
course.
they're not taking accountability, you know?
Sure. And I think that's what's most tricky these days. You had asked about today, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So I believe that as a man, for example, you want to be objective as much as possible. You know what I mean? You don't want, also, I think one issue though is that the umbrella for victim or the umbrella for wrong or the
Mm,
umbrella of being offended seems like it's ever expanding. Like the
mm,
definition of what's offensive, it seems like the list is growing and growing and growing. And then you
mm,
have cancel culture and things like that. So I would say the challenge is balancing being objective with saying, wait a minute, is this,
mm.
are we oversensitive? Are we too easily offended? You know, at what point is it being too easily offended?
Yeah.
And that's, again, that's all subjective. That's always been subjective. That's where it's tricky. So for
Well, that's
me,
where accountability comes in, right?
right,
Those first three steps in the book, like you said, if you're doing that,
exactly.
you have a better sense. Yeah.
Right. So if someone feels they've been wronged, I believe they should be heard. I believe that we should be as objective as possible. And that, I believe that's a team effort, to be honest.
Mm,
So for example, I can be objective and say, let me examine my behavior. Am I contributing to this unknowingly? I would say for the women to say, are we expanding the definition of being offended? Is it too far? Is being a victim a fad?
mm,
You know,
mm.
is it a bandwagon thing or is it legitimate? I would say the toughest part is cutting through all of that.
The toughest part is even asking that question, right? Because that's a
Exactly.
question that
Of
certain
course,
people would hear that even being posed hypothetically
of
and
course.
just destroy you for it. Like, how dare you ask that question?
I
And
agree.
on the one hand, I get it. I understand why they're worried about victim shaming. They're worried about all the things we just said.
Sure, sure.
But if you're trying to be objective, you have to entertain it. You have to consider it. It's a possibility that we have to look out for. And
Right.
that's a tricky dance, right? That's a tricky line to
Oh,
walk.
most definitely, most definitely. And I would say too, as far as whenever people bring up, the thousands of years aspect,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
would say we, and I would say even in regards to race or gender or whatever it is, I don't know that we can necessarily get into balancing karmic scales to
Mm,
say, okay, well, now we should absolutely hammer men at every opportunity, no matter who it is, because of what happened in the
mm,
past.
mm, mm.
2023 is not going to balance out 1923
Yeah, yeah.
or,
You can't
or
go back and
whatever.
change that.
Exactly. So all we can do is, I'd say to be objective is right now.
Yeah, it's well, I wonder for you, like
Mhm.
the idea that we can't go back and change that, right? We can't offset all the karma that's happened over the thousands of years. True.
Right. Right.
But if there's a feeling where, like, well, I guess let me ask you, let me just ask you straight up. And again,
Sure.
answer however you're comfortable answering. Do you
Mhm.
think the patriarchy is a problem? Like, do you think there is an inherent issue with the patriarchy or men to some extent where we do need to fundamentally change? Maybe not, we can't fix it all in one day or one year,
Sure.
but there is something fundamentally wrong that we need to fix to make it even out and actually get society where it should be.